Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Andrew Dalton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Adams County Historical Society here in historic Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I'm really excited to be with you again for tonight's Thursday evening program. If you're new to the Adams County Historical Society, we are a large repository here in Gettysburg with over 1 million historic items that tell the incredible story of our 300-year plus community. We have a research library and a giant collection of records, artifacts, photographs, and accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln's address, and so much more. Tonight, the program will be presented by Hal Jespersen, who's actually probably a map maker you may have seen through his work, if not through his name. He's done thousands of maps of Civil War battles and battlefields, and you may have seen many of them on Wikipedia, in numerous books, magazines, and all over the internet. And I'm really excited to listen to Hal's story of how he became a Civil War era map maker, and the story of how he actually creates these maps. And I think it's something that you'll enjoy hearing too. Hal is a retired computer industry executive who has a strong interest in studying the Civil War. He was in the U.S. Army Signal Corps in the 1970s. Then he held a variety of computer software jobs in Silicon Valley and then retired in 2010. It was in 2004 that he began to make real contributions to the Civil War articles that you've seen on Wikipedia. And he's the author of about 130 battle and campaign articles, as well as an equal number of biographical articles about Civil War generals. In addition to the text, he's created a large number of battle maps, which are available for free use online. Now, Hal operates a small cartography business, www.cwmaps.com. And he specializes in customized Civil War campaign and battle maps. And close to home, he was recently named Cartographer of Gettysburg Magazine. I want to give Hal a chance now to introduce himself and unmute and introduce himself. Thank you so much, Hal, for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be with you.
That's great. So without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to Hal to start his program. And if you do have questions throughout the program, please feel free to ask your questions in the comment section, and I'll do my best to direct them to Hal. And we'll certainly save some for the end too, for consistency. So I'm going to let Hal get into it now. Thanks again, Hal, and we're really excited for your program tonight.
Okay, so we should be sharing the screen. Is that correct?
Yes, I think we are good to go.
Excellent. All right, well, thanks again, Andrew, and welcome everyone. So this is the alternative name to behind the scenes of Civil War cartography is Mapping for Nerds. And I'll get a little technical on some issues of cartography, but you can tune out on those parts if I'm boring you with that. Let me click on the right screen here and then, all right, wait a minute. Here's an outline of my presentation. I'll be talking about my history, some famous cartographers who influenced me, how I work with authors to determine content, and what challenges I have in producing maps for publication. I'll go into some details about my tools for map making and the workflow that I use, and then some technical aspects of cartography. And we'll finish up with a discussion of how accurate are 19th century maps as a basis for modern maps of battlefields. So I've been doing maps since 2005, and it's now a little hobby business in my retirement from the computer industry. I've done over 3,500 maps, as Andrew was saying, and I recently was named the cartographer for Gettysburg magazine, and I'll show you some of the maps I've done for the magazine as we go along. This is my very first Wikipedia map, and it's quite simple and a little embarrassing compared to what I'm able to do now. It emphasized the simplicity of the Battle of Cedar Creek, but it was pretty crude graphically. I replaced that map in 2011 with a more detailed map that's more topographically correct, has better terrain and features, and a lot more battle detail. But I'm sorry to say it's not a very good map because it's not practical for most books. It's good enough for Wikipedia where you can look at it online and zoom in on it and see the details. But trying to reproduce this in a black and white book is quite challenging. Now I have a more recent version of the battlefield that I've been working on for the Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation. And this is an example of some of my more modern techniques. This map is a little simpler in terms of battle action because it only covers the period from 5:30 to 6 a.m. at the Battle of Cedar Creek, whereas the previous map covered the entire morning. But it gives you an idea of the improvements that are available with more modern cartography tools. So I've improved my techniques by using government and other freely available data to show accurate terrain elevations, accurate water courses, railroads and towns, and optionally, if a client wants, the modern road network superimposed over the terrain. Some of my clients want to use maps for tourism purposes rather than purely historical purposes, and that's the reason, like for instance, in this map that you can see the interstate highways and the US highways, along with Stuart's route up to Gettysburg. So cartographers who influenced me, the granddaddy of them all, of course, is Jedediah Hotchkiss. He was a school teacher and a mining geologist born in 1828, and he was only 33 years old when Stonewall Jackson asked him to make a map of the valley. His map of the valley, when you see the original version of it, is actually as large as the front door on your house. It's quite large and detailed. And I have been told that it's quite geographically accurate, although I normally just use subsets of it when I'm working on maps. I never use the entire map because the amount of detail would just overwhelm anything I was doing. The most influential cartographer is someone you probably never heard of. I mean, for me, is Edward Krasnoborsky, who did the very easy to understand maps in the West Point Atlas of American Wars. My father owned this 2-volume set and gave it to me, and I've been hooked on it ever since. I received from it the focus on simplicity of unit depictions and movements. One change that I've made is that I don't use the NATO symbology in my maps. If you look at this one, you'll see the little rectangles with X's and lines over them and symbols inside. Those were not used during the war, so I typically do not use them on my maps, and most cartographers do not. Now here's one who did not influence me, but I thought it was really cool. David Greenspan. I'm sure you have all seen the American Heritage Pictorial History of the Civil War. These maps are completely inaccurate, but they're quite captivating. This one, of course, is from the Battle of Chickamauga. A mapper who is known for simplicity is George Anand, who did all of the maps for Shelby Foote's Civil War and Narrative trilogy. And I really enjoy the great simplicity and ease of understanding of his maps. A modern cartographer that everyone knows is Steve Stanley, who has been working for many years for the American Battlefield Trust, doing all of their maps. He features super detailed actions and very accurate topography. His original maps, I understand he actually drew the contour lines by hand, but it's quite apparent to me that he no longer does that. However, I think that this map does not fit my style because there's much too much action on a single map, and it's rather difficult to follow. My interpretation of why these maps are so complex is that the trust is trying to appeal to donors, and those donors sometimes have ancestors in a variety of units. And when they look at a map, they want to see where great-great-grandpa fired his cannon on a particular battlefield. So you have to add all of that detail. Whereas my maps are generally a bit more simplistic for easy understanding. And of course, closer to home are the two cartographers who preceded me at Gettysburg Magazine, John Heiser and Phil Lano. They had the super detailed maps of all facets of the Gettysburg campaign, so I've used those for years. They worked at a disadvantage in that they did not have a color palette available to them until very recently. I, however, as the new cartographer there, got the agreement with the publishers that I could use full color on my maps. And so these are examples of maps that I've done recently for issues of the magazine. Okay, how do I work with my clients? A vast majority of the work that I get comes from referrals. I don't advertise. And so previous publishers who have worked with me in the past and are referred to me, and also people who have seen my free Wikipedia maps. I have about 200 clients in my portfolio, and there are 4 different ways they can provide me input for the maps. Let's go through those 4. First one is they can request that I take one of my Wikipedia maps and convert it into black and white. As I said earlier, these full color maps aren't really suitable for printing. But in this case, with quite a bit of work, I can turn them into something that is at least understandable. Although I have to say that I don't enjoy doing this kind of map anymore, and I discourage clients from approaching me with that idea. I have much more sophisticated mapping techniques that you'll see as we go along. The second type of input is when an author will say to me, well, just draw me a picture of the Vicksburg campaign, or of the Atlantic campaign, or of the Gettysburg campaign. And I've done these many times, and I can do them without very much input from the author at all. So here's an example of one I did for Dan Masters for his History of the 32nd Ohio. Sometimes it's a map that is not widely known, but there are published maps that exist. The author will point them out to me and specify lists of changes they would like to make. Here's an example I did for the Emerging Civil War series of from the second day of Gettysburg. It's loosely based on the information from Harry Fance's book on the second day. And then the fourth type is when the author has done detailed research for what I would consider to be a micro tactical map, one in which the details are highly important, and they give me a sketch map. So Dennis Rasbach has an outstanding book on Joshua Chamberlain in the Petersburg campaign. And this is one of the maps that I did with him, where he gave me quite detailed information about where all of the units were located, and a detailed look at the terrain that he wanted to show. So those are the 4 kinds. Now, you might be surprised to know that it is much more challenging for me to do a black and white or a grayscale map than a full color map. And the reason for that is that so many things that can be depicted in different colors on a color map end up being different shades of gray, such as the difference between a stream and a road, or a stream and a contour line. And doing those in color is much easier, but most books are in black and white, so that's a cross that I have to bear. Another challenge is that these maps are typically much smaller than the Wikipedia maps I originally did, which are quite large. And typically they're only 4.5 to 5 inches wide. There's limited space for type, for labels on streams and roads and so forth. And publishers of real books frown on type that's smaller than 6 point. You have all seen type smaller than that, but you have to get your reading glasses out and look at it pretty closely to deal with it. And it's particularly difficult to read tiny, tiny type when we're using shaded relief background in the image. One final challenge is proofreading. You would probably be surprised at how few authors actually proofread the maps that I do for them closely. Sort of embarrassing, really. So I do my best to make sure that every label that they ask for is there and it's spelled correctly and punctuated correctly, which is sometimes a source of conflict with the authors. Okay, well, let's jump into the nerd stuff here on how to make the maps. Here's my workflow. I take a variety of data sources that are available from the government or open source places such as OpenStreetMap, the National Atlas, Natural Earth, the US Census Bureau, and so forth. And I load those into a program called Global Mapper. This is a commercial program from a company named Blue Marble Geographics in Maine. And it allows me to put all of those different sources on layers that I can select which features I want to actually export. And so the two arrows coming out of Global Mapper here show both raster files and vector files. A raster file is one that is pixel based, like a photograph. And those files are the ones where I have my shaded relief background and land cover information. Whereas vector files are mathematical descriptions of things such as state boundaries, roads, railroads, and rivers. Those are actually in the format of an AutoCAD file, whereas a raster file is either a JPEG or a PNG file. So the rasters go into Adobe Photoshop, and I size them correctly, and then I clean them up. And I'll tell you a little later what cleanup is necessary for some of those raster files. The vector files go into Adobe Illustrator, which is a graphical markup program. And I merge those in with the Photoshop cleaned up files. And I add the historical info that either is provided by me or from the Official Records Atlas or from the client. Add the labels and so forth. And then I export those as an image using formats that are different based on whether I'm doing color or black and white work. So this is a screenshot out of the Global Mapper program. It's actually an older version, but it'll give you the idea. There are many layers that are shown in the box in the bottom left, and all of the different features that are being collected by those layers can be shown. And then using a variety of the tools that are at the top of the screen, I can edit them. I can select which ones are going to be exported. So let's do a little cartography here. How do we project onto a map? And the question is, how do you take land that is sitting on a sphere, the Earth, and project it onto a flat surface? And there are many different ways to do it. The most popular or most well-known one was invented by Gerardus Mercator, a Flemish cartographer in 1569, and it's called the Mercator format. And there are different variations of it, but it's used by most online maps that you're familiar with. If you go to Google Maps, you will see that a Mercator map lines up with them exactly. And one of the goals that I have in mapping is that you could take one of my maps and make it semi-transparent and lay it down on top of a Google map, and it would align exactly. So the advantage of the Mercator projection is that it's easy to calculate routes and distances between points, which is good for a map. But as you get farther away from the equator, the areas artificially increase. They look larger. And as you can see from this example of the United States, it does not look natural to you. The states up in the northern part are artificially larger in appearance than the ones down closer to the equator. So instead, for a wide scale, a wide area map, what cartographers call a small scale map, we use, or I use, a projection invented by Heinrich Albers called Albers conic equal area projection. And this is a more natural look. The areas are equalized, but the problem with this is that the north is not always straight up, and east-west lines between the points are curves. So it can sometimes get a little hard to figure your way around this, but you have all seen pictures of the United States that look essentially this shape, I'm sure. How do we show elevation in a map? In a lot of the old Civil War maps, they used a technique called hachures. And of the three images on this screen, you can see a very clean example of how hachures are used to show the slopes around a hill. The second image in the center shows the Franklin battlefield, Franklin, Tennessee, and a variety of hills that are using hachures. Now, on the right is a map that I did of the Franklin battlefield, and I think you'll see that this is a lot more natural looking and certainly more exact view of how these hills are composed. In theory, hachures would be useful to me for some line-oriented maps, but I frankly have never been able to figure out how to do them reliably. So I do not use that technique. Instead, contour lines are a lot more familiar, or a lot easier to understand for me, at least. They're familiar if you've seen USGS or military topographic maps. And Global Mapper makes it relatively easy to create contour lines for the maps that I create. But if you use just the contour lines, it's not the most intuitive interface for a casual reader of the map. One way to make it look more natural is to use a technique called hypsometry. And if you can imagine taking all of the area within a contour line that is a constant elevation and making it, giving it a shade or a color tint, you can much more easily show where the high areas are and the low areas. Most professional cartographers use a color palette that's selected similar to the map I'm showing here, so that the lower elevations are green and the higher elevations are brownish or white that look more arid. Now, just as a hint, these colors depict only elevation. They don't depict vegetation. It's just they selected the colors to be more reminiscent of those. Now, I use hypsometry in a way that was inspired by later versions of the West Point Atlas, the ones that you can find online. And this example of the southeastern United States shows how the lower elevations are white, slightly higher are a light tan, and as you go higher and higher, they get darker and darker. And here on the left is a color palette that I use to show those varying amounts of elevation. So here's a look at the northern end of the Battle of Gettysburg, or battlefield of Gettysburg, with a hypsometric background. And as you can see, Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill and Benner's Hill are all in the, and Oak Hill up at the top, are all in a darker shade with a contour line around them. And I think those are easier than simple contour lines to figure out. But the best method that I like is shaded relief, because you can impart an almost 3D-like appearance to the hills. You can see using the shading of the sunlight, the actual shape of the hills. And when you combine those with contour lines, they're even better. And unfortunately, this technique doesn't work for a really small scale map. In other words, a wide area map like a theater or a campaign map, because it's just too busy. But for a small battlefield map, what we call a large scale map, it works very well. Now, out of Global Mapper, I can exaggerate the elevation. If you look at the image here that's marked 1X, this is what the elevation of Little Round Top and Round Top look like at Gettysburg without any exaggeration at all. It's quite subtle. And in fact, if you took a model of the Earth that was exactly accurate, it would feel like a billiard ball. Even though there are mountain ranges all over, it would be very, very smooth. So you have to exaggerate to allow the user, the reader, to understand what you're doing. And I'm showing here examples of 2, 3, and 8 times exaggeration. I usually do battlefields at 4 times and theater maps anywhere from 6 to 12 times. And I can also adjust the angle and the azimuth of the sunlight that's causing shadows on the battlefield. So I can take publicly available elevation data, bring it into Global Mapper, and these are normally called DEMS, digital elevation models. I'm not going to go into the details of where all of these come from, but if you go back to this presentation later, you can read some of these details. It's usually available for free. There is commercially available digital elevation data available at even higher resolutions, but it can be very, very, very expensive. So here's an example of a really small scale map. Down on the bottom left it shows how the parts of the United States are divided up into squares that contain this digital elevation information. And here once again is Little Round Top and Round Top shown at this resolution, which is about a 30-meter resolution. Going down to a 10-meter resolution, what we call 1/3 arc second, these are the ones that I mostly use for large-scale battlefield maps. And an emerging set of data called 3DEP, or the 3D elevation program, is available at a variety of different resolutions. These are not always available for Civil War battlefields. Only about 25% of the United States is mapped in this way. And as you can see, it's quite detailed. So sometimes cleanup is necessary, like removing modern quarries and removing road beds that weren't there at the time. But it's useful for things like stream beds and otherwise. So I mentioned cleanup a couple of times. Let's look at that. Here is the part of the 3rd Winchester battlefield from the USGS topographic map. And coming out of Global Mapper using a 10-meter resolution at 4 times exaggeration, you can see that there is over on the left-hand side of the image, you can clearly see the roadbed of the interstate highway that cuts through Winchester. And you can see that hills are being bisected. And you can also see some artifacts up in the upper left of warehouse districts and other things. So I use Photoshop to artificially clean these up. This is not the most scientific way of going back to the 19th century, but I try to give the reader a better idea of what the battlefield was like at the time as best I can. Then when I do contour lines associated with this, I have to manually edit the contour lines to adjust to these changed images, which can be a lot of work. The data sources I use, in addition to the, well, let me discuss the data sources just from the start. A starting point for many cartographers is what is called the National Map, published by the U.S. Geologic Survey. And this has state and county boundaries, rivers and lakes, highways and railroads. Of course, they're all modern. None of these are 19th century. There's a lot of high-level data involved in this. Let's go through a sequence of extracting data from that national map. The picture you're seeing now is from a source called OpenStreetMap, and this is becoming very widely used on the internet. When they're not using Google Maps, they're using OpenStreetMap. So I can take the state outlines from the National Atlas. In this case, I've color-coded them because some of my maps use color-coded states. I can get lakes and large rivers from the National Atlas and add streams and rivers. Primary roads are generally interstate highways and major expressways. Secondary roads are some state highways and county roads. And also there are residential roads available as well. Now for railroads, these databases have the modern railroads. And so what I had to do is create my own database that had the railroads that were in use during the Civil War. And so that's what I'm showing here. The way I was able to figure that out is by looking at historic maps and also knowing that in many cases, the railroads are still using the same roadbeds today as they did during the war. There was no sense in moving them. That's not always the case, but that it is often the case. So I use this specialized file rather than the national modern railroads nowadays. For modern tree cover, there is a database called VCF that has a colored pixel for every 30-meter square of forested area. And this is only useful for wide areas. And in fact, it's only really useful for modern maps. Now, one final type of data that I use is called KML. KML is a format that was invented by Google to go along with their Google Earth program. And I have created over the decades exact geographic coordinates for every town that I typically use, and building, and geographic feature, and ford and ferry. And I keep these in a file using a format as shown down in the bottom left. It's a text file with digital coordinates, and then I can just drag those into Global Mapper. And the main effort that I have from that point on is deciding which of the hundreds and hundreds of labels that I have do I want to remove from the map. Because as you can see, this is way too many labels for a particular map. It has to be subject oriented to decide which labels are relevant. So putting all these layers together is relatively simple using that workflow I showed before, but there's still a lot of work to come. And we'll talk about that. The other public domain sources are, just as an aside, are OpenStreetMap, as I mentioned, and Natural Earth. The US Census Bureau also has a database called Tiger, which has files for every county in the United States with many, many abundant details, including streets and alleys and highway lanes and so forth. So let's look at Tiger from the Census Bureau. This is what the Census Bureau says that the Manassas battlefield looks like today. I've color coded things a bit, but what I am required to do at this point is add labels. And I'm sorry to say that using the tools that I have, the labeling is done entirely by hand. I have to know which of the roads are worthy of having a label, how to fit them onto the streams, and where the highway labels go if in fact it's a modern map, as this one is. Then yet another database called the National Land Cover Database can be used for a large scale map like this to show where wooded areas are, where marshy areas are, and where built up areas are. And I can take that into Photoshop, manipulate it, and then turn it into this style of showing the wooded areas on top of the map that I showed you previously. And then I can finish it off by adding in the labels for units and showing how they move around the battlefield and so forth. But all of that is done by hand. So let's finish up with a discussion about 19th century maps. Some maps are a lot better than others. And Gettysburg, fortunately, has an abundance of really accurate, very good maps. I had to do all of my fences and buildings for my Gettysburg base map based on two different works that are very closely related. One is the Friends of Gettysburg map set, and the other are the maps done by Gouverneur Warren after the battle. And this is just a portion of my base map that shows where all of the fences end. You can guess where the roads are, but those are in a separate layer. A lot of things have changed since the war, which makes it challenging to create maps. We've mentioned elevation changes for freeways and land leveling and filling up. Some rivers have changed course, either because they've been meandering around or dams have been placed and there are now lakes instead of riverbeds. Tree covers, the tree cover has changed dramatically for many battlefields. The railroads have not changed a lot, but the roads have. Some of the, I'll talk about roads in a little while, but even some of the town names and the boundaries of the towns have changed. Unfortunately, the historic maps that are available such as in the Official Records Atlas, are usually not accurate enough to translate directly onto the real terrain. So what I do is I start with the real terrain, and then I examine the historic maps and intuit what changes should be made to the modern maps to create the historic maps. I don't start from scratch like Jedediah Hotchkiss did, sit on the back of my horse with a notepad and try to figure out where everything is. I try to translate modern terrain backward in time. Some Civil War maps are super accurate, such as this one by Colonel Gillespie of the Winchester battlefield. But a problem that I have with them is that they do not use modern projections. Remember, we talked about Mercator and Albers Conic and other projections. They don't use them. I'm not sure what they did in that era. There are ways that I can use these maps to match up with the modern terrain. And in some cases I have done so. Other cases I just do it by eyeball. The ways to do it, there are two ways to do it. One is called geo-referencing. Tools, including a global mapper, and there are some others available, allow you to overlay an antique map onto a modern map, and then by using brute force, you can sort of move known points to correspond on each, and then it skews them around, and it seems to match up. I more frequently actually just use Photoshop and find ways of doing warping of the original, of the antique map to match all of the main data points on the modern map. Now, rivers can be a real problem. Most small rivers stick to their courses if they are in a well-defined valley. Earlier, I showed you a map from the West Point Atlas that included the Chancellorsville battlefield. And in Chancellorsville, there's in the Rappahannock River is a very well-defined river valley. And so I'm quite certain that that river did not move more than a few feet in the last 150 years. If you look at the Jedediah Hotchkiss map, it's quite inaccurate based on the way the terrain actually lays out. And unfortunately, in Esposito's book, they just traced that map. I was surprised later on to find that out. An example of a river that changed course dramatically is the Mississippi River. And one of the complications for me is that the state boundaries were established long ago when the river was in one location, and then the river has moved, but the state boundaries didn't. So some maps look a little odd with state boundary lines and the river crisscrossing each other across the terrain. I would refer you to Harold Fisk's map of the Mississippi. He did a series of 8 maps that showed all of the way the river has been meandering around. It's quite fascinating. So the upshot of this meandering is that I have to adjust maps sometimes pretty dramatically because the river has moved around a lot. And this particular example is from the Battle of Belmont, Ulysses S. Grant's first major battle, in which you can see the path of the river in 1861 and where it is now in a darker blue. And some of the action of this battle is actually underwater today. And there are many examples of battlefields that have been changed, such as Fort Henry is entirely underwater. Island number 10 is different. Vicksburg has changed around a lot. Morris Island is underwater. Port Hudson is rather different. Now, roads can be a problem because the historic maps are often not very accurate. And I show an example from the OR here around Fayetteville, North Carolina. And you can see that the maps, that the roads follow very gentle curves. And it is apparent to me that they told the cartographer, connect these 2 towns with a curvy line. And they did not have accurate terrain available to show the way the road would have moved around hills and not directly over them and so forth. So depending on the scale of the map, sometimes I can use modern state highways, not interstate highways, but modern state highways as useful surrogates for historic roads. And the authors I deal with sometimes live in the local area of the battle, and they can identify where an historic road trace exists that would not be apparent to me from a map. And as I said earlier, railroad tracks are usually in the same place. So that's my presentation. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I would invite you to check out my 2 different websites. You can get over 200 free Civil War maps from my civilwarmaps.com site. And if you're interested in my traipsing around Civil War battlefields, my posix.com site is where, if you press the little travel button or the Civil War canon button there, you can read my travel logs. So I understand we're going to have some time for questions.
Yes. Yep. We'll give it. If anyone has any additional questions, please go ahead and post them now. One question we had is from I believe Gary, who asked, do you ever use north or directional markers or arrows in your maps?
I like to avoid them, and the exceptions that I make, the times that I include them, are 1, if the author specifically asked me to use them, or 2, if the map is not pointing naturally north. The reason I don't use them is that I would say 98% of the maps I draw are pointed north. And if you go on the internet and look at a map on Google Map, as an example, it's naturally pointed north, and everybody understands that. But there are cases where a map doesn't point north. As an example, I've done maps for battlefield display signs, and they will be oriented toward where the action is, and they have to be set so that they are pointing east or west or south. And in that case, they need to have the compass. And when a series of maps has 1 or more maps that does not include a north, that is not naturally pointing north, I use the compass rows, they're called, on all of the maps in that series, just to be consistent.
That's great. Thanks, Hal. Another question, do you ever try to correct historic maps by using, warping technology? I know I've seen some sites where you can kind of modify a historic map and bend and twist it a little bit to get it more to scale, presumably so that you can then overlay it. Is that something that you've done, or do you find it's not really as productive as just, taking the old map and then correcting it yourself on the new map?
Yes, that's the technique that I talked about called georeferencing.
Right.
And I have used it, although frankly, some of the tools that support it are sort of cranky.
Right.
So I more frequently use Photoshop to do that manually rather than trying to use a specific georeference tool. But I often just do it by eyeball.
Right.
It depends on how complex the battlefield is and how large it is. If it's a very small one, like say Little Round Top, the Battle of Little Round Top,
Right.
it's not necessary to do that because you can easily eyeball the difference between a historic map and the modern map.
Right. That's great. And one last question. I think this is a good one to end on. Do you have a favorite historic map of all the maps that you've worked with?
Favorite historic map?
I guess that's an open question of what you define as historic. I guess from the period.
No, I know. No, I was going to say I very frequently use Nathaniel Mitchler's maps of in the Eastern Theater. On the one hand, they're very detailed and useful in that regard. On the other hand, the copies of them are so poorly reproduced that they can be a pain to use them. So do you mean like artistically?
Yeah, I think I think that's what the person might be getting at. More, do you have one that is just really visually appealing that you found, a map that you would spend a lot of time looking at and enjoying? While you're thinking, I'll say mine is the isometric map by Batchelder of Gettysburg, which is, I actually have it hanging in my home. It's just a gorgeous,
Is that
almost
the one
more of
that's
a,
looking at it from the side? The side
yes,
views are, yeah, I'm
it
familiar.
is. It's not north oriented, and it's very interesting. Every part of it is the same scale. So you can look at something far in the distance and it's drawn at the exact same scale as what you see in the foreground. So it's a fascinating map, and down to the detail of, painting structures, the color of the structure that the structure was during the battle. Batchelder, as you probably know, was meticulous in his detail, in terms of not just this map, but then later working with the Warren maps and making corrections based on field notes. So yeah, I enjoyed what you said about Gettysburg having an abundance of maps. That certainly is the case, and we're lucky here to have so many to work with. I'm sure that's not the case in a lot of other places.
So I'm going to draw a blank and say I like my maps better than the historical.
Very good. Well, I'm sure many would agree. And I want to thank you again, Hal, for joining us tonight. This was a wonderful program, and we had many comments are just flowing in saying how much people have enjoyed learning more about your work, and about the what goes into this. It's such a sophisticated process, and I think people look at a map and don't always appreciate the hard work that goes into it. So thank you again, Hal, and thank all of you who've been with us tonight. I really appreciate you spending your Thursday evening with the Adams County Historical Society. If you enjoyed the program, I hope you'll hit the donate button at the bottom of the post and support our efforts to preserve millions of historic items here in Gettysburg. Thanks again, Hal. I really enjoyed the program, and I hope we'll hear from you again, perhaps at some point for another program to follow up on this great presentation tonight. So thanks again, Hal.
You're welcome.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. We appreciate your time.